Yeah. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming to the Public Accountability meeting in August. We'll start with attendance and apologies. We've got apologies from Deputy Chief Constable Winwood, Jane Wintermeyer, Head of Legal, and Julie Mulligan, the Police and Crime Commissioner. I'm chairing for today. And we'll move swiftly on to the minutes and actions. On the minutes, has anybody got any comments on page 1, which is effectively who was here or not, which I think is accurate? Page 2 and page 3. Okay, thank you. And for the public's point of view, the reason the minutes are so short is because the meeting's available online for people to watch. So do go to the OPCC website and have a look. On the actions, there's only 4 actions that remain. The first, Tom, is for you on the sort of the journey the Victim Services has been on.
Yep. So we've had input from. We've had further input from Jenny's team. The final draft's on Julia's desk at the moment, so hopefully that can go to the Minister pretty soon.
Can we close that then?
Yes, I think we can.
Great. Always good to close an action. 207 was for you, Jenny, and Bill Scott about the street triage numbers in York and Selby appearing to sort of go down relatively drastically over not that long a time frame.
So, as I understand it, because the crisis team is also manned by the similar pool of staff that's used for street triage in York, there was a limited number of people available for crisis, and the street triage team was being utilised to prop up that service. Right. Therefore, that's now been rectified through recruitment, so that those numbers should go back up. But I have to say, from a commission services perspective, we don't pay for York Street triage, so it's not within our gift to stop that from happening.
No, I see. Okay, but as you say, we should be expecting that street triage to pick back up again now the crisis team is staffed.
Yes, and that's been for a little while now, so the numbers for this month should be much better.
Okay, I'll leave that open and we'll just keep an eye on the figures as they come through for the next couple of months.
There's a mental health public accountability meeting in 2 months.
So we can review it then. Thank you. 208, that was a action for Andy Took about speeding and drink driving, and which of those two cause the most accidents. We've had an update from Andy that nationally speeding causes more accidents than drink driving does by, I think, about a third, but it was about 200 to 300. Andy's still looking at the information for North Yorkshire, so we'll bring that back here when we have it. So we'll keep that open. And the last action, 209, was also for Andy, just to get a written response to his question on road safety at the last public accountability meeting. That will be uploaded as soon as possible. We've got the wording now, albeit his verbal answer is also online for anybody who wants to watch it. So we'll close that. They are actions complete. So questions from the public, of which we have had 2 before the meeting. Put my glasses on so I can read them. We have one from a Simon Cahill, which I'll read out. Julia Mulligan, any chance of the overstretched Selby Police Force doing something about antisocial behaviour in public places? Problems need addressing, especially Scott Road Field. It's now a drinking den for middle-aged men and the bushes are their toilets. I had a quick chat with Assistant Chief Constable Kane about this, but first thing to say to Simon is to report those things, if you haven't already, via 101. And we'll come on to 101 more generally later, but if you can make sure those things are reported, and if your friends and neighbours are suffering similar concerns, if they could report them too, it gives the police that picture they need to be able to respond. But I'll hand over to Phil as to what he might be able to do to help.
Yeah, it's just to provide the reassurance that the Safe Neighbourhood teams are working towards dealing with antisocial behaviour in that area. With regards to the specific complaints, I think if we can get the details of Mr Cahill following the meeting, we'll make sure that the local Safe Neighbourhood Inspector, Ian McNiff, contacts him.
Okay, Mr Cahill, if you're watching, we'll try and get in touch with you to get your contact details outside of Twitter so you can get in touch with the local team in Selby and hopefully get those concerns understood and addressed. The next question, and the last one, from Andrew Walker. When are you resolving the 101 problems? Not to fudge the answer, Mr Walker, but we come to 101 later in the agenda. The Commissioner asked for 101 to be a standing item on the agenda for the foreseeable future. It's sort of embedded in the performance update towards the sort of back end of the meeting. I think, but don't know for sure, Julia's wish was for it to become a sort of formal part of the agenda. So 101 is a specific and separate part rather than as part of the performance update. So if for the next meeting we have a separate agenda item for 101, that would be great. And of course, we'll come on, Mr. Walker, to what NYP are doing and North Yorkshire Police are doing to solve 101 later on in the meeting, and we'll summarise that in a written answer to you outside the meeting. I think that's that for questions from the public. We may get some through the meeting, and we'll address those at the end. So I will hand over to Assistant Chief Constable Kane on this month's thematic, which is domestic abuse.
Okay, thank you.
You can just scroll up and down.
So just moving on to the first slide there, it's just to outline to you that obviously within the police and crime plan, domestic abuse comes under the objective to provide an improved response and reduce harm to people at greater risk. With regards to that, overall we've got a 5-year trend data that shows a recurring annual increases in the number of domestic occurrences that are reported to North Yorkshire Police. Correspondingly, the crime data follows a similar pattern with regards to that as well. York continues to experience the highest levels of reported domestic occurrences, followed by Scarborough and Harrogate, who represent no change from the previous years. This is largely around proportionate representation to the residential population. Now, again, just going on to that, I think domestic abuse is one of those areas I had a lot of strong focus on in relation to raising awareness, confidence in the public reporting. So I'd expect to see a rise in reported domestic abuse in line with the work that we're doing. So it's not a case of us expecting to see a reduction in that area.
No, you're right. It's one of those areas we want to see more reports of. Is that the same nationally, Phil? Is there increased reports across the country as well as in North Yorkshire? We're not an outlier in that respect.
No, we're not an outlier, no. No.
Okay.
So with regards to embedding that within our control strategy, so the priority areas for North Yorkshire Police, domestic abuse is included as a priority under safeguarding vulnerable and exploited people. And we have revised the domestic abuse problem profile, which was published in July of this year.
Can you just explain what a problem profile is?
So essentially what we do is we use our North Yorkshire Police data, our partner data as well from local authorities, third sectors and others, and we review our intelligence, our incidents that we've attended, and essentially we score that through our threat assessment system to outline where that would sit in relation to priorities of other areas of business that we'd be experiencing, such as child sexual exploitation, etc. That helps us define what the control strategy priority areas are for the force for this year, of which domestic abuse is one of those.
And I know part of the scoring, there's a acronym called MORAL, which you might be able to, I can't remember what they all stand for, but...
Management, risk and law enforcement.
Thank you. And of which part of that is those areas that score highest tend to be the ones where the police might understand the least about it, not so they don't understand it, but the least about it, because there are gaps. So modern slavery, I know, because
yeah, it's one of the factors where you'd add a weighting, so that we need to have a look at our ability to deliver against those areas. So it's not for all of them on the control strategy that we don't understand them. It's that some of those areas, yes. So those emerging crime types that would be seen in the county, such as human trafficking, modern slavery, that's an area we'd be focusing on to understand more about it. Domestic abuse with us, it's in relation to actually understanding the true picture of how much is out there and how effective we are against dealing with it.
So my question is, how well do we feel we do know what's out there? So some of the harder to reach communities, be them Eastern European or whatever else, do we feel like we've got a good understanding of...
Nigel will come on to explain that through his presentation, if that's okay.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. So in some of the key objectives in relation to that, to go back to you, Will, on that is North Yorkshire Police staff and officers have got the requisite skills and knowledge to identify those cases that we're talking about, looking for those and being able to respond to cases of domestic abuse that are taking place, improving our effectiveness to work with our partners and service providers so that we can maximise prevention and intervention opportunities as opposed to just reacting to when a domestic abuse situation has taken place. And again, we want to provide a supportive environment where we're able to learn from any mistakes we may have made in the past and enhance the level of service that we're delivering going forward. And this really, the aim is to ensure that we're delivering the safest possible service we can to those domestic violence victims and improve the confidence. If we see that there's improved confidence in the way that we're dealing with domestic violence, more individuals will come forward, so we see a rise in domestic violence as being a positive in relation to that. So I'll hand over to Superintendent Costello, who's the lead for domestic violence for the force, and Nigel will go through the rest of the presentation for you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Phil. You'll see that when we come to the slides in a moment, you'll see that our performance with regard to prosecutions and convictions are at the highest since 2011 and 12. Our conviction rate is higher than both the regional and national conviction rates. However, we're not complacent and we continually strive to improve our practices and processes. So much so that we had a domestic abuse peer review by Durham. We asked them to come and have a look at our internal processes, our working with partners, and our performance in relation to domestic abuse. There is greater governance now through the Joint Commissioning Group, the JCG. Before, domestic abuse never really sat easily on partnership boards. There is standing agenda items at both the adult and children's boards, but now it obviously is governed by the JCG. The last HMIC inspection, we got good for the effectiveness inspection and the vulnerability question specifically. There were two AFIs, area for improvements in there, which I will come on to as we go along with the data. So the data relied upon for these slides is from the recently published problem profile, which was published in 2017, which Mr. Kane has just referred to. And that analyses statistics from the period of January to December 2016. However, where possible, I will also talk about data for 2017 to make it as current as possible. As already touched on by Mr. Kane, 5-year trend data shows recurring annual increases in the number of domestic occurrences reported to North Yorkshire Police. Correspondingly, crime data follows a similar pattern. Data for the financial year 2016-17 shows this to be a 5% increase. The increase is expected. There continues to be a focus on vulnerability both locally and nationally. There is great awareness of domestic abuse for both professionals and the public, increased confidence in reporting to those charged with the responsibility for supporting victims and tackling perpetrators, and who in turn have become better at recording incidents.
Can I ask, Nigel, the public might not understand why we have X many occurrences, but only X% of those dealt with as crime. Can you just explain the difference and why those that on that graph, they're not sort of equal? You know, the public might think every domestic abuse incident is a crime.
Well, all domestic abuse incidents that we go to don't always mean that there is a corresponding crime. It might be a verbal argument that doesn't actually mean that other than that verbal argument it's actually escalated to anything, thankfully, more serious. Sometimes what people perceive to be a crime are also not a crime in the letter of the law. So although we have a number of incidents, a number of incidents that we go to as a demand, not always they correspond to crime. And I think it's almost half the offences that we go to, domestic incidents we go to, correlating crime.
And it looks like that ratio's gone up, as you just sort of referred to. Does 50%-ish feel about right to you? And you might not know the answer to this, but how does that compare with others of, I don't know whether similar forces or national?
I think it's difficult when you try to compare yourselves with other forces in relation to data sets that people use. I don't think we're an outlier. I think we're probably around average in relation to crimes per incident.
Okay.
I think the other thing there as well is that as we push and drive the training around vulnerability, safeguarding, domestic abuse in particular, we'd expect our officers to be picking up on more crimes there. So I'd expect that to be rising, to be honest, as opposed to be.
Absolutely.
And it's a changing picture to certain extent, isn't it, with new crimes, coercion and...
I think if you look at coercion and control, I think if you look at stalking, harassment connected to domestic abuse, the more we can push that to our staff, I think the more you will see correlate with crime.
And do you think part of that, so that ratio has gone up from 30-odd% to 50-odd% over from 2012 to nowish? Do you think that is as a result of just an increased focus on training and awareness and those kinds of things?
Yes, and I think there's more awareness by other professionals, and I think there's more awareness by the public in general.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Nigel, just for the benefit of the public, because you could read that and think that domestic abuse occurrences and crime, that domestic abuse is a crime. there is no specific crime
No,
of
there's
domestic
no,
abuse?
no, there's no specific crime of domestic abuse. So domestic abuse obviously relates to a definition in relation to an incident that involves usually an intimate partnership. And then crimes that you would charge people with, or crimes that you would investigate in relation to those incidents, would be assault, theft, damage, burglary, all connected with a domestic setting, if you like.
Thank you.
Okay. So York continues to experience the highest level of reported domestic occurrences, followed by Scarborough and Harrogate, representing no change from previous years. This is largely proportionate to resident population, as Mr Kane touched on. Westfield Ward at York and Castle Ward at Scarborough are our most affected wards for domestic abuse incidents. July, August and December months remain as those months with increased reporting, especially weekends, and July especially so. The levels of reported occurrences per 1,000 population has increased across most districts compared with 2012, and the highest increase recorded was within Richmondshire and Hambleton. The number of both victims and perpetrators have increased in 2016, and this includes the teenage cohort, because what you've got to remember now is domestic abuse obviously includes 16 years plus. Public safety, welfare, domestic incidents, PSW as we refer to them, and crime violence continue as the predominant occurrence types, collectively accounting for 82% of all reports, similar findings to 2015.
So
Almost half of domestic abuse incidents in 2016 are recorded as crimes.
And crime violence is?
So you'll have your Section 47 assaults, your common assaults,
So it's physical.
physical or sexual.
Sorry, can I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
I presume some of the gap between the occurrence and the crime is also people who don't wish to actually make a complaint or to lodge a complaint,
Potentially.
potentially.
You would still, if there's still sufficient there to record
To
a
record a crime, you should record a crime.
So it's,
Okay.
it's irrelevant in terms of
And
whether they want
I
to follow
presume
it.
there's also some way of trying to understand whether there's an element of coercion in that lack of willing to take something forward as well.
Yeah, and that's part of the officers' training in relation to how
Yeah.
they deal with that. So officers should be looking to separate the
Yeah.
parties, speak to them individually, as opposed to doing that all together in the same.
And some offences are more evident than others. If you go to an incident of an assault, that is more evident usually than coercion and control. They are much more difficult to identify and pick up on. But that is the training that we're giving people so that they can actually, if they're attending incidents and there's been previous incidents, to deal with it in the round rather than isolation, that you take everything as a whole that's come to you.
And just one question, they're slightly off topic. If a partner's defrauded their other partner, would that be accounted as a domestic abuse or a fraud, or is it both?
Depends what the circumstances are in relation to it,
Fine.
really.
That's fine. I just
Yeah.
If there's controlling or coercive behaviour in relation to the finances, then it's domestic.
Yes, if somebody's controlling somebody's finances, i.e. not allowing them access to money, not allowing them access to funds, that would be coercion and control. If they've defrauded them out of money that grandma was leaving or whatever, then you would probably look at it as a fraud rather than anything else.
Right. Thank you.
Okay. Assault occasioning actual bodily harm and common assault feature most highly. Domestic related rape recorded in 2016 accounted for 40% of all rape offences within York and North Yorkshire. 26% of locations, predominantly residential, were repeat addresses for domestic abuse occurrences. Holiday parks also continue to feature highly. Primrose Valley, by way of example, had the highest number of domestic abuse occurrences in 2016, which was 20. These are similar findings to the previous year. But of note, obviously, predominantly for those holiday parks, they are not usually North Yorkshire residents. They are those that are travelling to us from other areas, which obviously adds its own complications because of people that come to our county that we're not already aware of, who may be very violent.
And am I right in thinking some of those holiday parks have what turn into the biggest licensed premises that we have in the county almost, because they're quiet half the year, but then they get full and busy. And
Yeah,
so
absolutely, yeah, and they all have licensing restrictions, but they do have licensed facilities within the holiday parks, most of them.
So it's a complex picture. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Is it me for the next slide, mate? Thank you. Oh, sorry, thank you. Just before we go on to the actual graphic of repeat victims, I just wanted to talk just generally about victims. The number of both victims and perpetrators have increased in 2016. Female victims aged in their mid to late 20s are most prevalent, peaking at 29 years. Numbers decrease as decades progress. Mental health is recorded in 11% of domestic occurrences and represents a notable increase compared with the previous year. Alcohol and drugs recorded as a factor in domestic abuse occurrences show little change. Alcohol at 21%, drugs at 2%.
Do you think that mental health that increase is again awareness as much as anything else?
I think more awareness of mental health, yeah, definitely. Minority communities such as black, minority, ethnic, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender and disabled groups continue to be underrepresented in reporting domestic abuse cases. Those from the travelling fraternity, the military and victims aged mid-50s and over are also underreported. It's recognised by agencies that underreporting by those post-mid-50s is potentially attributable to a number of factors, including a lack of understanding of domestic-related abuse, stigma on social conditioning together with shame and isolation, social and geographical. This obviously affects both urban and rural communities. Campaigns targeting this demographic have been implemented county-wide. Perpetrators in descending order, where the victim is aged 55 plus, have been male child, the partner, husband, ex-partner, female child and then male grandchild. It's accepted that those in rural communities are underrepresented with regard to reporting domestic abuse. However, the number of domestic abuse occurrences in rural communities reported within York and North Yorkshire in 2016 per 1,000 population, aside from Scarborough, is not noticeably lesser than some of the urban areas. For example, Rydale and Richmondshire have between 10 and 11 occurrences per population, as opposed to Harrogate, Selby and York, who recorded between 12 and 15. Therefore, the local disparity may not be as great as that identified by national research, which was conducted in early 2017 to test the hypothesis domestic abuse is underreported in rural areas, which utilised data from 11 forces across the UK. Regarding rural reporting, it is also difficult to establish from North Yorkshire Police systems what wards or areas are truly rural, as often urban and rural areas can be combined under one ward code. But as previously stated, there have been an increase in Hambleton and Richmondshire and in general Beedale ward specifically.
Yeah, I mean, deciding what rural and what isn't rural is a nightmare, as is rural crime, which I won't ask the Chief to explain, to go into now. Okay. That's really interesting, Nigel, especially on the North Yorkshire specific stats and the occurrences in rural versus urban. So if we could take that, just get as much information from you about that after the meeting, that would be interesting. But that's sort of heartening to a certain extent that it doesn't seem like some of the barriers that might exist in some parts of the country might not be as prevalent here. So,
just in relation to the repeat victim graphics, the top graphic shows an increase in percentage of domestic crime linked to repeat victims, but we need to put some context to this really. This is the headline domestic abuse figure, so it includes violence, sexual offences, thefts, damage and fraud, etc. It doesn't account for risk, so high, medium and standard are all included. We are recording more crime, post-crime data integrity in 2014. Victims may be reporting due to confidence and better identification and recording by North Yorkshire Police. There is also in there some historical reporting, and the underlying data shows that the increase is linked to violence without injury, plus spikes in sexual offences and thefts that contribute. The second graphic shows the increase of percentage in victims who are repeat victims. This shows that more victims are coming forward, which unfortunately means there are more repeat victims.
So on the face of it, Nigel, that's slightly worrying, because what we'd like to see is obviously less and less repeat victims. Is what you said at the end there about reports generally going up, is that totally in line with the repeat victims going up, or are we seeing more repeat victims going up than we'd expect?
No, if you look at, and I'll come on to the MARAC data in a little while, but if you look at the multi-agency risk assessment conferences, MARAC, which deals with those at the highest level of threat, or those that are escalating, that are taken to multi-agency meetings, repeat victims for MARAC are actually coming down.
And so MARAC, just for the public, MARAC
is the multi-agency risk assessment conference. So it's where the agencies come together to actually put together some risk-based plan around the victims to support them.
And they'll be the highest risk.
And they are the highest risk, although North Yorkshire and York also can put medium and low, medium and standard to the MARAC process if we believe it's an escalating process. But I'll come on to those in a little while.
Okay.
For the repeat perpetrators, the only reason I put this graphic in, because if you look at it, it doesn't correlate with the rise in victims. But as I've said previously, the number of repeat perpetrators and perpetrators in general is actually going up. The reason I put this in is that if you look at some of the police data that's produced, it shows repeat perpetrators coming down, and that isn't the case. Because our recording systems will only show you as a perpetrator if you actually have a positive disposal. So if you are charged or cautioned, you will show as a perpetrator. If you are arrested and interviewed but no positive sanction comes from it, you are still a perpetrator. You just aren't recorded as such on our system.
Okay, so that graph is a reflection of if you've been given a disposal in relation to domestic abuse, not if you've been arrested in relation.
Yes, that they just show if you've had a positive disposal.
Okay, and do we know what the figures would be if we included arrest, or is that just impossible to know?
I don't know if I have that data currently. We can do it. Well, yeah, we can.
You then get an idea of whether that remains the case.
And I'll show. And I've got as we go forward, I've got the arrest data slides to show our arrest.
And I think the caveat I'd put to that is the reason there's a positive disposal is because there's some evidence in relation to what's taken place. So not everybody that's arrested, i.e. the malicious reports, etc., and other things that take place as well, is necessarily going to be a perpetrator. So I think we just need to be careful on correlating the two together.
I don't disagree. I suppose this is where looking at sort of data on its own doesn't always give us a very healthy, very clear picture of what it is that's happening. You know, on the face of it, seeing repeat victims on the up and repeat perpetrators on the down, arrests on the decrease.
It doesn't
it's
correlate
confusing picture.
because we record victims regardless of whether or not we can prove an offence has taken place against them, but we will record them as a victim. Perpetrators, if we're not recording a positive disposal against them, obviously, in the eyes of the law, they've not been taken to court, they've not had that hearing, so we've not recorded them as a perpetrator.
Okay.
So some of the challenges as well that we face in terms of interventions is there's a cohort of individuals who we'd like to see have positive interventions, but they're not put in place through the courts, but we need to try and get to that cohort.
Absolutely.
To try and intervene earlier to have a positive impact. So that's some of the challenges we face with the type of data that we're looking at.
And this will be oversimplified, and I wouldn't know if it's a question for you, Jenny, or for Nigel, but if an individual gets arrested a number of times on a similar type of offence, will that crop up? You know, does the computer go ding and you go, right, Mr. or Mrs. So-and-so, we need to go and intervene?
Yes, because we have a process now in place through the Offender Management Unit where we will identify those individuals regardless, not just for domestic abuse. So in the last 12 months, if you've been arrested on a number of occasions and we believe that although a positive outcome hasn't been in favour of that individual, if we believe that they are a risk, then we will pursue potentially civil orders against those people. If we believe that they are a risk to the public at large, we will try and do the best we can to try and manage those individuals.
I think that process is trained out to our staff as well, and correlates across to domestic violence protection notices, where they're taking heedance of the history of that relationship and also previous relationships an individual might have been in as well. So it does take account of that broader picture.
Yeah, because as we know, and we'll come on to in a little while, we know unfortunately there are a number of people that call the police or other agencies for their service in relation to domestic abuse who then retract, who do not want to engage, who certainly don't want to go to court, and they certainly don't want to provide any evidence against the perpetrator. That does not mean that they are not at risk from that individual, and it's incumbent on those agencies who are here to protect those individuals to pursue as best they can all avenues to protect that individual by whatever means they can. Okay. So just going on to the arrest rates, you'll see the top graphic shows the domestic abuse violence with injury arrest rate, and the bottom one is violence without injury. There is a bit of a data lag on arrests, unfortunately, but that's again just our recording systems on Niche, which is the system that we use. Monthly data to June this year shows that the actual value expected for violence with injury to be around 80% for arrest with injury. Arrest rate for violence without injury is on an upward curve, and this is partially down to the increase in arrests for stalking and harassment, which is positive.
So, Nigel, comparing different slides, on occurrences are going up each year
Yeah,
and arrests are coming down,
yeah, yeah.
it looks like.
Yeah, can I just,
Yeah, of course. Yeah, yeah,
certainly,
yeah.
and certainly I'll try and cover some of that for you. I've had concerns in relation to our arrests and compliance with our domestic abuse policy, which is obviously positive intervention at the first opportunity that you can in relation to being called to a domestic incident. And we took a review of arrest data between April to December 2016 for violence with injury. And I use violence with injury as a barometer because, as we talked about previously, violence with injury is usually an offence that is quite apparent when you first turn up. And it's obviously clear that an offence has taken place. So we did a review of our arrest data, which was showing on Niche at that time, our recording system, as 77%. 77% I thought could be improved upon. And in fact, we did improve upon it. When we took other factors into consideration, when we did a dip sample of those, of a good percentage of those cases, of domestic abuse cases where it showed no arrest, when we looked, actually, when you took everything into consideration, it actually went up to around about 85%. That was because some people, when they've attended a domestic abuse incident, the perpetrator's gone. They subsequently get arrested for an unrelated offence. They get arrested for a shoplifting or something else. And as part of that investigation, they arrest them for the domestic abuse. So the domestic abuse arrest was actually on another crime report.
Right.
So it wasn't that no arrest had taken place, it was just with another crime. So there was those to take into consideration. Some of the offender-victim relationships weren't per the domestic abuse definition, so they weren't domestic abuse, they'd been wrongly categorised. Other disposals were appropriate that were used, and sometimes there were third-party reports where we were unable to trace the victim. Potentially a control room operator might have seen something on CCTV argument between a male and a female and believed that to be a domestic abuse incident, call the police, and by the time we get there, nobody can be found.
I've reported one of those, actually.
Ethical crime recording, it still might get reported as a crime depending on the circumstances of what you find. However, although we could safely say that went up to around about 85%, I still think there's room for improvement, and I'll come on to later victimless prosecutions, because I think that is an area that we need to challenge ourselves and try and improve upon.
Okay, Fraser.
Okay.
Thank you. Just quickly, in a wider context, do we know yet what the effect of the changes to the bail legislation over the last 6 months has had on arrests generally, and whether or not that's reflected in these arrests?
It shouldn't have an effect on domestic abuse arrests, because the arrest for domestic abuse, certainly around injury, in every case you've obviously got to take on its merits, but certainly for injury, and that's why the barometer, I use that barometer, because for me, for physical violence, there should be some intervention, and that should not be by appointment, because you're trying to reduce the risk to that individual. And what we've got to remember is, at the end of the day, I know domestic abuse covers a wide range of offences, but it's the violence that you're trying to prevent, because you're trying to prevent homicide. Because that's what predominantly a lot of domestic abuse incidents, sorry, not predominantly, but a lot of murders can be attributable to domestic abuse incidents in the first instance. So that's what we're trying to reduce in relation to it. So I don't think the Bail Act will impact greatly on that, if I'm honest with you. I think it's just making sure. The one thing that does impact on it more than anything is the victim's wishes. And sometimes I think we take into account the victim's wishes far too much, when we should actually be thinking about what the risk is by not taking positive action.
Which is a very delicate balance.
It is a delicate balance, because we've pushed the victim's voice, we've pushed the victims, working with the victims and doing what the victim wants at the victim's pace. Unfortunately, domestic abuse is one of those offences that you can't always take into account the victim's wishes, because if you do so, you leave them at risk.
Yeah.
and sometimes you step over that threshold to actually intervene against their wishes, but by doing so you know that you will be keeping them safe.
Okay.
And that's the balance. And that's where we've got to improve, because I think there has been occasions where we've taken into account the victim's wishes, where the victim has not engaged with us and we've taken it too quickly. And I know that body-worn video is something that we talk about which will improve it, but it will only improve it with the mindset of the individual and if he's got the right mindset when they first go in. Because the body-worn camera will only record, it'll record everything that's obvious while it's running. But it's no good recording if you're not going to do anything with it. If it records injuries, it records violence, it records damage, but the victim says no, well, that's when you need to say, I'm sorry, I understand what you're saying, but to keep you safe, I have enough evidence within this, evidence from the neighbours, evidence from your 999 call, and if we want to keep you safe, we need to do something. There's no point having the body-worn video if you're not going to use it properly.
Yeah, and
It's not the panacea, but will it help? Yes, it'll help.
Yeah, and the training that goes with it, obviously.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Two very quick questions on the back of that. One is, totally understand why the barometer is violence with injury, because as you've explained, there needs to be a good reason why you wouldn't progress an arrest.
Yes.
What are we've got arrest figures for violence without injury there. That's generally just harder because there's less physical evidence, but would you hope to see that go up?
Yes,
as well?
and it can. Some of the offences for violence without injury, as I say, you use the barometer for injury because it's something that's tangible, it's something you can see. Some of the other offences, coercion and control, it's difficult. Sometimes it can be difficult because obviously it can be quite subtle, the coercion and control, and it's a lot more, it's a lot more investigation to understand actually what's all been going on. Where if you go to an incident where there's violence, you can see it straight away.
No, I suppose what I'm saying is you're not you're keeping an eye on everything else going
Absolutely,
on as well. It's not,
absolutely,
yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, and you'll see from the next slide. Sorry, I can't see it. I've got my glasses on.
Sorry, just on that, and we need to be clear for the public that the police service have a responsibility under one of the police and criminal evidence codes that any arrest has to be necessary, and there's quite stringent conditions around that, which is one of the explanations why arrests per se across the country have dropped. But what's missing from here is all those people that have been spoken to sort of away from the custody facility, because arrest is one of the most coercive powers that the police service has. So I think it's just painting that broader picture that that legal obligation is there in the mind of the officer before they intervene.
Yes.
But clearly, as Nigel says, if there's a obvious offence of injury and violence, then that meets the necessity test.
Yeah.
And that's the one that I use because if we're doing that right, I think you can anticipate that most of the others will follow, and it's just making sure that if they're presented with something that's quite apparent, then they should be using their full powers to keep the people safe.
So the other thing is, and it might not be now to come onto it, Nigel, if you're going to cover it later, but that's arrests, which I presume you don't need to be arrested to be given an out-of-court disposal or a harassment information notice or some of the other
The domestic violence orders and stuff like that, we should be using domestic violence orders wherever we can. Domestic violence orders, you can actually use them whilst you are progressing an investigation. It's a means of managing somebody's risk and having some control over that individual to help them and help the victim to manage themselves so that there are no future incidents. That can be achieved by potentially some bail conditions, but under the new Bail Act, those are very few and far between. But they are there for instances of violence and stuff. Those conditions should still be used.
So one of my questions would be, I don't expect you to have the answer because the data is not in front of us, but whilst we see arrests come down, and the Chief's explained why arrests are, they need to be necessary, but will we see out-of-court disposals and HINs and other disposals go up? I.e., is there a direct correlation that we're arresting less, but we're doing other disposals more? And is that...
There's domestic violence protection orders are used. HINs, the harassment warning notices, aren't a disposal. There are just a warning to an individual, a bit like a corner child abduction warning notice. It's only to notify the individual that their course of conduct is alarming and so that it wouldn't come as a shock to them the next time you turn up to tell them that it's persisted and you're going to do something more robust with that individual. So a HIN, and I think this is where there has been some confusion nationally with harassment warning notices, police information notices, call them what you want, they've all had different names. You probably won't have seen, but there has been an inspection report that's come out from the HMIC and also from the CPS, which has said that police forces should scrap harassment warning notices forthwith. Now, I've contacted the College of Policing and the NPCC lead for stalking and harassment to say, are we just taking these recommendations as they are, or is there going to be a national working party? What's the direction coming out from the NPCC lead and the College of Policing? And at the moment, they have said forces shouldn't go unilateral. They should all stick with the national programme. There is obviously going to be some working groups now developed in relation to those reports and have a look at the recommendations. But as we currently stand, harassment warning notices can still be used and should be used in the right instances until some national direction is given.
I think what we're going to reflect on is the training given to officers and dealing with the domestic abuse incidents is about how do they keep the individuals safe. And there are a number of options for officers to keep those individuals safe, and their training and reflection on for them is picking the right option.
Yeah.
So I think, and that's the element for me. So it isn't
There are
just
lots of
about
options to
arrests.
choose from, aren't
Yeah,
there?
it's about actually, is the person safer as a result of your interaction with
Absolutely.
that individual?
Absolutely.
And every time it should be yes.
Yeah, and that's the training we're pushing at the moment is you don't have to identify all the vulnerabilities that you're attending, but what you need to recognise is there is some form of vulnerability, and before you walk away, before you leave that premise, what have you done? What have you done to make that individual safer? Who have you notified? Who have you called for help from? Because if you can't put your finger on it, but you know something's not right because you can feel it, what have you done?
And I totally agree with that. And I suppose a question is, how do we manage and monitor that? So you could say having this arrest slide is almost meaningless. What we want to know is, are people safer and what we're doing to keep them safer? But that's not necessarily a certain disposal or an arrest or not an arrest. It's different to that. And how do we keep that brief?
Yeah, I think there's always a place for utilising the powers that have been afforded to us if they are proportionate and necessary for the outcomes that you are trying to achieve. And every case will be different and on its merits. But what we've seen previously for the harassment warning notices and things like that is we've been too quick to go to those, thinking that that is a disposal or that is some form of control over an individual, instead of actually saying, actually, I need to investigate what's been reported to me first, and then decide what the best course of conduct is for me to pursue, not going straight to the harassment warning notice thinking that solves everything, because it hasn't. And we've left people feeling isolated a little bit because we haven't treated them properly in relation to the allegations that they've made.
And are we comfortable both, we've got the training here to frontline staff
Yeah.
dealing with these cases, are we comfortable the training might not be the right word, but the wherewithal is there with supervisors to look at that safety element rather than disposals and outcomes?
Yeah,
and
I mean,
other stuff?
all domestic abuse incidents cannot be closed on our systems unless a supervisor signs it off. So a supervisor has to sign off the domestic abuse incident, either saying, no, it doesn't fit the definition of domestic abuse, or there's no crime, or whatever, or the 253 risk assessment, the domestic abuse, stalking and harassment risk assessment that you should fill out for every domestic abuse incident. A supervisor should sign that off in relation to he's happy or she is happy that the detail on there is enough for a risk assessment for professionals going forward to do something with.
And I think the other element, and not to steal Jenny's thunder for her presentation, but the answer to is the person safer is not just a policing answer, it's multi-agency. So I think when we've gone through Jenny's presentation and Nada's presentation, hopefully you get a feel for what's available there to assist in keeping people safe.
Because that's what I was just going to say, is the thing that we probably need to do a little bit more on is making sure that we are confident that every 253 has a referral into support services. We are pretty confident, but we could be more confident. We could
Yeah.
continuously improve the assurances that we have that that's happening.
And we're changing the 253 document to actually include the referral process documents at the back of it, so that it's a prompt straight away in relation to, you need to now make a referral in relation to it.
Because I'm going back to speech and crime plan, an improved response and reduced harm to people at greater risk. Effectively, arrests and other things got nothing to do with it. It's about reducing
Well,
the
it's
harm.
one,
and
it's a tool.
it's a tool,
so-
but in and of itself, we don't know whether that's effective. If there's some sort of management of is harm
Absolutely.
being reduced in this process, that's the bit we're interested in, isn't it?
Yes.
It is, yeah.
And kind of the support service side of things, there is safety planning is a key part of that.
Absolutely.
So it comes from both sides,
It
doesn't
does,
it? The
yeah,
support
it
and
does,
the
absolutely, absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
Enough of my questions, you can carry on.
Just moving on to coercive and controlling offences.
Yeah.
In relation, the top graphic obviously shows the domestic abuse crimes of controlling coercive behaviour, and obviously the bottom one shows the arrest rate in relation to those. And it's just to show that we are recording these offences, we are identifying them. Obviously the new law came in December 2015 to tackle perpetrators who subject spouses or partners or other family members to controlling or coercive behaviour.
And I'm not going to ask you to pick a number, Nigel, but clearly 13 to 29, there's already an upward trend and training will be getting better, and as people experience investigating it, they'll
Yeah.
get better at it.
Yeah.
How long do you want to see that increase go on for? So I don't need to say when we get to 100 we'll be happy, but do you see that going up for quite some time?
I would like to think it will. I would like, because I think the better we get at understanding it and our partners understand it, and the better we are at identifying it and dealing with it, then I think that those will go up.
Okay.
Just in April to July 2017, we've now recorded 29 offences of coercion and control. So those offences are starting to go up, and there is some crossover. If some offences within coercion and control and some offences in stalking will be classified as something else.
Yeah, I was
There
going
will
to
be either domestic abuse or harassment or whatever. Now, although I would like to see them all classified properly so that individuals can understand what they're dealing with, I think, again, as long as we are identifying something in there and we're investigating it, then hopefully that can be teased out later on. I think I would be more disappointed, I suppose, if we weren't identifying an offence, but we are identifying offences. We might not always be categorising it accordingly, but we are identifying offences because there is so much crossover in there in relation to what happens.
Yeah.
Okay, so prosecutions. CPS data shows that the current number of convictions, 668 in York and North Yorkshire, is the highest since 2011 and 12. Similarly, the number of defendants prosecuted is 842, together with guilty pleas, 631, has also increased. The North Yorkshire and York conviction rate for 16-17 is higher than both national and regional conviction rates. Discontinuance levels, however, also increased and are at their highest since 2011 and 12, which I'll come on to and I have touched on briefly. Myself and Leanne McConnell, who's the head of Criminal Justice Department, are starting to look at now. There was a letter to all chiefs indicating a reduction in the number of domestic abuse referrals from police to CPS. So we're just having a look at that in relation to ourselves to see whether or not that actually correlates with ourselves or what impact that has had on us, bearing in mind we have a good prosecution rate currently. We have a high conviction rate for rape, both regionally and nationally, which obviously includes the domestic abuse incidents, and now we have dedicated domestic abuse courts, and we're going to have a dedicated domestic violence protection order court at York for the county. We do need to improve on our retraction when we take retraction statements from victims. Currently, that stands retraction rates or discontinuance rates for offences that haven't reached CPS, so no further action by police decision, currently stands at about 35%.
Can you just explain for the public, Nigel, is that where a investigation has started. I don't know if an arrest is necessarily made,
Yeah.
but an investigation is underway and then it stops.
Well, yes, but it might be at the very earliest stages, so it might even be when we first attend the house and we are dealing with a call for service for that individual, but that individual retracts straight away or very shortly afterwards in relation to their engagement with services to say they do not want the police to prosecute, they will not give a statement, they will not provide any evidence against the offender. And at times when we've dip sampled that, again, we dip sampled this in 2017, and again we looked at an audit of cases for injury, violence with injury, and 97% of those cases didn't consider victimless prosecutions. Now, they may not always be, it might not always be apparent or evident that they will succeed anyway in relation to it, but it's something that you've got to consider from the outset, and this is why I talk about body-worn video. Body-worn video is only as good as the mindset of the individual who goes through the door.
And can you just explain what a victimless prosecution is?
The victimless prosecution would be where there is supporting evidence either from the officers in attendance who can see certain things. It might be the telephone recording on the 999 system. It might be the neighbours that report things, or other witnesses that have actually seen the incident unfold, who all give a statement or all provide evidence, but the victim hasn't. So the victim hasn't provided any evidence. But it might be that with all the surrounding evidence that's collated, and it's in the best interest of the victim to safeguard them, that a victimless prosecution has to be thought about.
And that's effectively where you might go ahead, you know, for safety reasons,
Yes.
against the victim's wishes.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. And again, I wouldn't like people to think that we would do that in every occasion, because we wouldn't. And it has to be proportionate, it has to be necessary, and it has to be, as I say, it has to be for the benefit of that victim. But sometimes victims will not engage either out of fear, that they still believe that they're in a loving relationship with the individual, or they have some sort of alliance to that individual, but they are still at greater risk by doing nothing, and that's when you need to consider it. Discontinuance rates for, whilst in the court process, is 16.8%, and again, that is usually victims who have provided a retraction statement during the course of the investigation, or just before you get to court, or in fact non-attendance, where they don't actually attend.
And I suppose the question is, why has that gone up, and what we're doing about it?
Yeah, well, I think there's, like we said there, in relation to the victimless prosecutions, I think we just need to have a look at it, analyse it, be a little bit more robust in relation to why those people are discontinuing. The reason why they'll be discontinuing is because either out of fear of what the court process will bring, that they actually want to stay in that relationship.
Would that necessarily be any different this year than 2012, though, if you know what I mean? They sound like reasons that you'd have each and every year, not that would go up.
No,
in
that's
2016.
right. And then there's got to be. I mean, the retraction statement, as before, if you make a retraction statement, then you've got to decide between ourselves and the Crown Prosecution Service in relation to where does that leave us. Non-attendance, again, that's down to the court then in relation to decide, well, how do we proceed with this, or are we going to proceed with this by non-attendance? We have a statement from the victim. Do they compel them to court or not? Similarly, for a retraction statement, if you take a retraction statement, we should be using the CPS pro forma, which is almost like a risk assessment that we submit to the CPS saying this individual has withdrawn their allegation and does not want to go to court, and then between ourselves and CPS we should be saying, well, where do we go from here? And is it in the best interest to still proceed?
But we're still not quite sure why they've gone up.
No.
Necessarily. So, because again, those, Fraser, I'll bring in a second. They seem good. I could understand why that would
Yeah.
cause a discontinuance, but not necessarily why they've gone up from at the highest level since 2012.
We're looking at other forces that have a better performance rate in this particular area to us. Overall performance rates for other forces are not necessarily as high as ours and positive ours, but actually we want to see the overall performance go up. So we're looking at what other practices are out there that we maybe can learn from.
Yeah.
The other element as well, and again, we need to understand the data more.
Yeah.
So need to caveat what I'm saying with that. But actually, if we're seeing a rise in reported domestic violence as well, then some of these may be first-time victims coming forward, and there's confidence issues as well about going into the court system and trusting us with what we do. So we need to ensure that we're building on and reassuring victims all the way through the process.
It's an interesting picture.
Just from the MSF data, so your most similar forces data, I can tell you that we do not stand out.
On discontinuities.
Yes, we are better than a lot of our most similar forces in relation to it. So there's nothing that really... There are some forces better, and there are some that are worse. So we are...
It's an interesting slide, this one. We've got conviction rates at really positive levels, which you should applaud everyone for, and clearly a lot of work's gone into that. But discontinuances being higher than normal, and I think, I'm right in saying Tom might know as part of the LCGB or Jenny, that numbers generally going to court are lower than some of our MSFs, I think. So it's just an interesting picture, isn't it, where conviction rates are good, numbers might not be so good, and discontinuances are not so good. And it's just trying to understand why, that's a sort of mixed picture. Okay, well, if work's being done, that's...
Yeah, it is, and that's what we need to understand more, because like you, Will, these are the areas that I want to improve on. If we can, once we understand it, that's where we want to push it to say that we need to improve those areas.
Fraser, do you think?
Thank you. I mean, it seems to me from the first two bullet points on the slide that, of 668 convictions over that period, 631 came from guilty pleas, which is a measure of the quality and quantity of evidence that you've produced to start with and have handed over to the prosecuting authority, which avoids all the necessity of your victim having to go to court and go through that process, but still allows the prosecutorial process to go. So that I'd have thought is a very encouraging figure in terms of the way in which the evidence is being obtained from all the sources that you've described. And therefore you would expect that actually further things, evidence capture such as video, would only improve that further, doesn't it? So if actually only 50 of those have had to go to a full defended trial. So the vast majority, when the defendant has been presented with your evidence, they, and with their legal advice, been told you need to plead guilty at the first opportunity. Is that right?
And again, it supports a reduction in that discontinuance rate, because if it's one word against the other, it takes a lot of courage for somebody to see that all the way through the court process. So if there is that additional evidence there, it gives that support to the victim.
Absolutely.
And I suppose, this is a delicate balance as to sort of how you deal with victims, but if we can explain guilty pleas are, I don't know what proportion that is off the top of my head, but really healthy proportion, it might give them the confidence that, especially with some other evidence like body-worn video, that might not be, they have to go through the full process, that it will stop.
Absolutely.
Okay.
When we talk about management of risk as well, we touched briefly on the MARAC process, which is obviously the multi-agency risk assessment conferences with our partner agencies. As I said before, they usually discuss high-risk cases, but in York and North Yorkshire we have included cases which have seemed to be escalating, and those referred due to professional judgment. So for 2016 and 17, and this data came from actually the Foundation annual report, cases discussed at MARAC county-wide had increased by 41 cases. And for the county, so excluding York, MARAC referrals have increased by 6% from 15 and 16. However, the number of referrals for York and Harrogate have decreased, and I'm not too sure at the moment why that is. That's something that I need to look at. Similarly, 45% of the referrals to MARAC are from police currently, 55% from other agencies, of which IDAS is 35%. Now, that's a bit out of kilter with what Safe Lives suggest. Safe Lives, obviously, is the national charity dedicated to ending domestic abuse. They suggest that the expected percentage of referrals from police is between 60 and 75%, and referrals from other agencies is between 25 and 40%. But that's not unusual for us for just this year. We've run like that for a while. I think I'm safe to say, Jenny.
I suppose, again, the proportions, to a certain extent, are neither here nor there. It's whether you think the process works and it's supporting victims through that process. That's the main thing.
And you're right. Did you want to say that?
I was just going to say that the good quality relationships that
Yeah.
we've got with our partners has a lot to do with that.
Yeah.
And in terms of the volume of self-referrals that we're seeing increasing.
It is, absolutely. And I will look at that in relation to it, but what I always go back to, and I tempt fate here by saying it, we haven't had a domestic homicide review since 2012, so we're doing something right. If you look at our most similar forces by, just as a barometer, a gauge, those have had in the last 12 months and longer, they've had a number of domestic homicide reviews. Now, again, that could be tempting fate, but I'd like to think that's because we are doing something right in relation to it. Is there room for improvement? Yes, there is. Are we complacent? No. Will we look at this to determine greater how our percentage of referrals from the police is down? Because some of our percentage of police referrals across the districts has come down. So we need to look at that and understand why has it come down so much. But one of the things that if you look at repeat cases going back to Marrack, that is something for me that would really worry me.
Do we see that?
No. We've actually come down. So Hambleton, Richmondshire, they've come down by 3. Scarborough, Rydal have come down by 27. Repeat cases, Harrogate, Craven down by 10. York's down by 35. Selby's down by 1. So the repeat cases that are seen within a 12-month period are actually coming down.
So this is going back to that early slide where repeat victims overall, not to necessarily sort of summarise that in one go, but are probably of quite low risk, whereas the very serious risk cases are hopefully less, certainly going by Marrack referrals there, less repeat victims.
Yes, yeah. And what we're doing, we're piloting it in York from beginning of September. The Marrack at the moment is fortnightly for York, fortnightly for Scarborough. I think Hanbridge is a monthly one, whatever. Actually, in York, we're going to weekly. We're going to twice weekly Marrack, because I want to actually know, are we managing risk properly? Because if we are identifying a domestic abuse incident today and saying that somebody is of high risk, why are we waiting 2 weeks to have a multi-agency conference about what plan we're putting in place? So we were going to actually do it daily. We were going to try and do a Marrack daily as part of the screening process that we already have here and we have at County Hall. We could do it. Local authorities could obviously do it. I think it was a little bit too much for some of the other agencies to be engaged on a daily basis, but what they've agreed at York to pilot is actually we'll do it twice weekly, which I think is a massive step forward. I really do. Yeah. And I think that should be us being able to manage risk, identify and manage risk at an early chance. And you should then start to see high risk should obviously be those that are imminent danger, imminent death. And you should be able to see those coming down and down and down, because if you're managing them more and managing more robustly and more frequently, then I'm hoping that that's going to make, obviously, and see the trend that we're seeing there is those coming down.
I think some of the good quality outcomes that we've seen are also around the support services that we've tried to get in earlier. So looking at trying to address victims' needs much earlier in the process, so the early intervention service that we've got in place, that means that actually we're supporting victims as soon as we know about them, which can have an impact on some of the things that Nigel was talking about, but it means that people are safer from a support's perspective.
Just touching very quickly, because I've just been prompted by Mr. Kane, and I'm obviously
my fault,
taking over and running over. So just very quickly, domestic violence protection orders, we did discuss them previously. We had 61 applications put before a superintendent in 16-17. 55 progressed to court, of which 50 were granted by the court. So obviously there's 50 domestic violence orders given for that year. 22 were breached, which resulted in custodial sentences predominantly. Domestic Violence Disclosure Scheme, this is a scheme also referred to as Clare's Law, which allows members of the public to request whether or not a partner is known for domestic violence, but it also allows the police to notify individuals of those starting a new relationship if there are any risks to those by a person that is known to us. So, right to ask, which is obviously those where the public ask us whether or not there's anything that we should tell them. There was 46 applications, of which we made 19 disclosures, which was similar to the previous 12 months. Right to know disclosures, we made 49, which was an increase of 10. But again, I'd like to see that go up if I could. I think that we need to have better promotion, better awareness of that. But that's one of the things that we're looking at the moment with the offender management unit and the processes that we run. And if there are individuals that we believe, we were talking about them previously, if we believe that somebody had been arrested, say 3 times for domestic abuse, but no positive sanction, and they'd moved on to a new partner, then we would be looking to make disclosures if we thought that that was relevant to do so, and it would keep that individual safe.
And potentially engage them in a voluntary programme.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. So strengths, just very quickly, Operation Encompass has been embedded since January 2017 across York and North Yorkshire. This is...
So is that in every district then?
It is, and that enables, that's undertaken by both the screening hubs at York and County, which they screen every domestic abuse incident form now that involves children within the household, and we will make disclosures to schools if we feel it necessary that they should know that the child is in a domestic abuse setting.
Are we comfortable with how that's
Yeah,
progressed?
it's doing very well. We've had some real positives from it as well, so it's been good to see. And to complement that, the DASH risk assessment that we talked about previously, that obviously is filled in for every domestic abuse incident, we've actually amended it, and it has now a section called In the Eyes of the Child, where we should actually be obtaining from the child their views on what's happening and how it affects and impacts on them, and how we then share that with other agencies. Talked about the domestic abuse seal.
Just ask on that, sorry.
Yeah.
How young can the child be in that situation? How young do you think that they are able to proactively give a statement like that?
It's not a statement. It's more just gauging from them. If we thought that they added any evidential value, then we would treat it completely different. But if we thought that it was something that we could offer them some sort of counselling or offering them some sort of service, or if mum's potentially not telling us a whole picture, but the child is telling us something completely different, then it would be something that we would look at in relation to it. But it's more for supporting the children. That's what it's about, because if children go to sleep on a night, then that will worry me, because they actually go to bed and they listen to it, and it doesn't bother them that they can fall asleep every night. Or similarly, if they're upstairs, what impact is it having on them every night if they're listening to mum and dad having a row? So that's why we do it, and then we can try and involve all the other partners in relation to how do we progress and keep that individual safe, and how do we give them some outcome as well, really, in relation to it.
So it can be pretty young.
Yeah.
Just to kind of come in there, it has been one of the areas where partners have potentially identified gaps in support services, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's one of the things that we're challenged with, because obviously our victims of crime money that comes from the Ministry of Justice can only be used for victims of crime. I think we could probably work with the Ministry of Justice on that, but all of our money is used up. So one of the things that we're trying to do with our partners is to look at what is the need and demand for those young people who are impacted by crime, but we can't currently get to access support services.
We've had a discussion this week, haven't we, in relation to a young child for support services in relation to it.
Yeah, for the public, just to clarify, for the money that we get to support victims with, you have to be a victim of a crime, not affected by it or victim of ASB or other things. So unfortunately, it's quite a tight definition when actually there's lots of people we want to support who aren't necessarily a victim in the eyes of the law. Yeah. So it is a bit frustrating.
It is, yeah. Just very quickly, Leicestershire now undertake our domestic abuse survey, and that's been ongoing. 2017 shows that 86.6% of victims interviewed were satisfied with the overall service provided. 89% were satisfied with the way the initial report was dealt with. 91.1% were satisfied with the actions taken by the police. 93% were satisfied with the way they were treated. Dissatisfaction is probably in line with the user satisfaction survey. Main issues about being updated, kept updated, and that's something that we need to work on and improve.
It's something I'll pick up with outside the meeting, Jenny, and with Steve Murray, but how closely related is that survey to the victims' needs assessment, where we know what it was victims wanted in the first place, within reason?
At the moment, probably not as linked up as it could be, well, but again, it's probably something we can continue.
And we can amend it. We can amend it all the time. So,
Absolutely,
because I asked for some stuff as well to be considered for it the other day. So, it's something we can amend that suits us basically in relation to it.
I think one of the things that we got from the victim needs analysis was asking for the right information at the right time is actually, one, really quite challenging, and the victims also don't distinguish between service providers, so that becomes really quite challenging. We've also got very positive information and feedback from victims about things like recommending the service, positive experience, and cope and recovery goals being met. But I think there's probably more we could do to make it easier for victims to ask and respond to the things that we want to know about.
Okay. Just very quickly, there's obviously the implementation of the mass screening hub now up at County Hall, which is the multi-agency screening team. So like here at York, we have police embedded with partners, including local authority and health. And as I say, they now look at the domestic abuse risk assessments as well. Just very quickly. Challenges, HMIC stalking and harassment report, which I referred to, and obviously we'll wait for some national direction, but in the meantime we are looking at our own processes and amending and pushing out awareness and raising awareness for our own staff in relation to stalking and harassment, so that people are better informed in relation to those offences.
Rob, on behalf of the Federation, sorry to sort of bring you in out of the blue, how does it feel for the Fed in terms of training for these issues, especially those coercion and control issues that are particularly difficult sometimes to identify? But are those frontline staff feeling like they've got what they need?
I certainly, in my time in the Federation, I haven't been made aware of any concerns raised by frontline staff in relation to training and training provision regarding those issues.
Good.
But perhaps it's something that we could go out and conduct some research on, and I'd be happy to do that.
Well,
I'll quickly come on to that in a minute. Coercion and control factors. Gosh, sorry. Go on,
Just going to say, from a stalking and harassment perspective, we've also been talking about interventions, haven't we?
Yes, we have.
And at the moment, we don't have a specific intervention from a perpetrator perspective, but we've been looking at what is available from a national perspective and what we could put in place.
We're fine if it's domestic abuse related,
absolutely.
because they will get picked up by IDAS.
Yeah.
If they're not domestic related, so they are stranger stalking, somebody from work, for instance, a colleague, then we don't have the schemes. We'll discuss that in relation.
I have given HMIC's report, and we've had concerns about the use of HINs or PINs and whatever they're called before. It might be stalking and harassment comes back separately. I know it's linked to domestic abuse to an extent, but it's also separate, and I suspect this might come back. It might come back stalking harassment at some point. I say come for the first time. I don't know, probably not for a little while, but at some point. So we can go through those things in more detail at that point in time.
But coercion and control factors in suicides mean now that they do fit the domestic homicide review. So if, for instance, somebody takes their own life, unfortunately, and they've had coercion and control factors, then that would trigger a domestic homicide review. Interestingly, I had a conversation with Jane from York around domestic homicide reviews, because I was looking at whether or not one fitted the criteria for a recent murder in York, which I'm happy it didn't in the end, and we had different processes and mental health screenings as well in relation to it. But one thing that did come out of that was Jane was saying she doesn't have a budget for domestic homicide reviews, and if we have one, they're about £15,000.
I understand neither CSP has budget for.
No, it's not been allocated or set aside, although everybody, all the partners around the table have said, should there be one,
I'm sure.
or you obviously find the funding.
This might be a silly question, Nigel. How does one? What's the investigation prior to a domestic homicide review to find out whether coercion and control might have been involved in the first place? Because obviously you might find, do you see what I'm saying?
I would think predominantly those people will be already known to us from a domestic abuse related incident or background prior to that incident.
Okay.
But if not, we should be doing that as part of our background checks really for the cause of why, because we've got a duty for the coroner.
No, I just think because it's so hard to understand sometimes that coercion control. If someone's not on any police or partner radar and something happens to them, homicide or suicide, trying to understand
Absolutely.
what if
No,
it must be really difficult.
Yeah, okay. I've put training there. I think there's more to be done with training. We keep pushing out awareness. We keep pushing out training in relation to coercion and control. There'll be further training in relation to stalking and harassment, but it's just keeping it fresh all the time in relation to it. So that's always a challenge for us in relation to that. Data quality becomes an issue. I've talked about that previously. Sometimes making sure systems actually can record and produce what you want them to produce. Victimless prosecutions, obviously, I've talked about, and hard to reach hidden communities is something that we're on with all the time in relation to how do we engage with those better, how do we get those people to understand how they can get services from the police and partners and report things to us, because some of those individuals might come from previous countries that they don't have any confidence in the police service or other agencies, and it's just trying to build those links all the time really.
I was just going to say that we've commissioned IDAS, our domestic abuse partner, in a number of areas to deliver community engagement as a service, so which is about outreach into communities, how to reach communities, and those where we've identified those underreported, which again has seen some improvements in kind of self-referrals and access to services.
And we've been mapping our communities, because I asked for this to be done in relation to not only domestic abuse but also modern slavery, in relation to identifying our communities and how diverse they are and what's the makeup, and then we can approach them to try and obviously engage them of how
you can
to
predict demand a bit better, can't you?
Yeah, absolutely. Opportunities, obviously, I've put there about body-worn video, daily MARAC, which is going to be twice weekly MARAC now, and then obviously there's a new domestic violence and abuse bill that's been announced in May 2017, but obviously that's got to progress. But there will be a domestic violence and abuse commissioner, very much like the modern slavery one, I would think, which obviously brings its own demand from them in relation to forces and other organisations. And there's obviously going to be new civil prevention and protection orders. So that's obviously something to be aware of that's coming in the future. We've got an innate collaboration between Northumbria University, Durham University, North Yorkshire Police, West Yorkshire Police in relation to innovation in policing domestic violence, understanding success to build capacity. We've had a previous collaboration with Northumbria Police and others from the region, where we successfully bid against money, which we gained. We've got a University of York student who is undertaking some research about domestic abuse training for us, and we have our own internal staff, one of which Jo Brooksbank, who is currently at Cambridge University on a 2-year research project, but she is looking at the MARAC process and looking at whether or not the domestic abuse risk assessment form versus professional judgment cases, what is the difference in the service that's offered, or is there any different outcome for those individuals? So I think there's some exciting things that are ongoing there. So.
Nigel, thank you very much. That was a very interesting and helpful presentation and discussion. Can I ask, not back to this meeting per se, potentially the relevant people outside this meeting, but in 3 months, 6 months or so, get back together and have a look at those areas that are really good to see in conviction rates and guilty pleas and other things, and make sure we're making the best of that, but also coming back with those areas of concern like repeat victims or victimless prosecutions and some other things, arrest numbers, and just see if the work you're doing in that interim has sort of made a difference or not.
Absolutely.
Okay, we won't put actions per se, but we'll figure outside the meeting how we can do that. Jenny, sorry.
4 slides.
Well, you've got, I think we often only need 15 minutes to canter through the performance papers. We might need slightly longer because the 101 might need a bit of discussion. So
if I
20
go through
minutes, give or take.
If I probably about 4 or 5 slides might do that anyway.
Over to you.
I
And
think
apologies again, Jenny.
that's all right.
Microphone.
Microphone, yes. So you'll see on this first slide, in terms of outcome and vision for victims and offenders, so we're looking to support domestic abuse victims to cope with the immediate impact of crime and recover from the harm experienced. We're looking at reducing the severity and frequency of domestic abuse crimes going forward. And from a vision perspective for victims, we're looking to offer appropriate support for all victims of domestic abuse who report to the police or not. And we're looking to achieve fewer first-time and repeat victims. From an offender perspective, it's pretty similar. So we're looking at reducing the severity or frequency of offending. And we're looking at reaching all North Yorkshire domestic abuse offenders that are not mandated to undertake interventions by the court, and then fewer first-time and repeat offenders. So that's what we're looking to achieve as part of Commissioning Domestic Abuse Services. We've got 8 commissioned services in relation to domestic abuse, so that's 8 victim-related services and 4 offender-related, because all of our offender-related services have a victim component to them.
Okay.
So we don't deliver anything to offenders that doesn't also address the victims of those offenders. The Independent Domestic Violence Advisor Service is a single point of contact for practical and emotional support after crime, through the criminal justice process and beyond. The counselling service is...
Can you explain, Jenny,
Yeah.
what an IDVA might do?
Yes, so an IDVA is around, so what they'll do is they'll do a needs analysis. So they'll assess needs against the 9 categories of need, which are on a couple of slides further on, but we won't go through them in detail. They'll work with an individual to develop a cope and recovery plan that's specific to them. They'll also work with an individual to develop a safety plan that's specific to them. And then dependent on the journey that the individual victim is going from, they would support them at court, if that was appropriate.
Could you summarise it as effectively being a sort of one-stop shop for that victim? They can provide a range of sort of advice and services and access to people and things.
Single point of contact, case management type approach. And if the individual needs to access any other services to support their cope and recovery journey, then that IDVA should be supporting them to access that. So advocate on behalf of the individual as well. So that's, if you like, the intensive service that an IDVA can offer. Counselling is another service that we provide specifically for domestic abuse victims. So this came on the back of the victim needs analysis, where counselling, which was free and directly accessible without a waiting list, was something that was identified as not currently available in North Yorkshire. So we've commissioned a counselling service that's been available since October 2014. Significant proportion of victims accessing that service are domestic abuse victims. Another significant proportion are sexual violence and abuse victims, and those most in serious need fall into the other kind of category as well.
So that's a specific change we've made after speaking to victims to find out what they wanted.
Absolutely, yeah. Same with the restorative justice service. So this makes sure that we can make sure that an individual can meet with their offender with the support of a restorative justice practitioner, should they wish to. Domestic abuse victims, it's not a large cohort that go through restorative justice. It's usually, I say usually, we've had 3 occurrences last year where domestic abuse was the reason why we went through a victim offender conference. Those were inter-family cases, so it was usually where there was a younger perpetrator and an older victim in some kind of family relationship. And again, the outcomes of those were very positive, so we don't use restorative justice for domestic abuse victims in the main, but where we do, there's definitely positive response from victims about how useful that process has been. Also, some of the kind of information we've got is actually, could you offer that to us earlier in the process as well? So we need to look at that.
Do we think, given we know it works most of the time when it happens, do we push it? Might not be the right word because it's clearly a very difficult situation that the victim's in, but do we do we make victims aware early enough about the service?
I think there's always more we could do. One of the things that we are doing now with
Do people
every
understand it
victim-
more to the point? Do you,
I think it's difficult, isn't it? Because it's probably not the thing that is foremost in a victim's mind at the point of crime, which is when we contact them from a supporting victims perspective, or the first thing on an officer's mind when they're talking to a victim about what's happened. So we have to think about the right time to share the information with victims, which is something we've been working on with our restorative justice provider. But there's always more that we could do. And the number of times that you offer a service often increases the likelihood that it's utilised. So there's more we can do around repeat offering as well.
Forgive, I'm already questions left, right and centre. There's a lot on offer. What's the awareness level of the staff and officers providing these services about all this stuff to keep in their head, or, you know, somehow explain to a victim there's got all these things you can access now?
And that is part of the challenge, isn't it? And one of the key issues, which is on one of the couple of slides that I will just go through, is that from a victim's perspective, we've got multiple services around cope and recovery at the moment. That's both ourselves and our partner agencies, so county and city predominantly. So one of the key things that we are looking at doing in order to solve some of that is to look at joint commissioning. So that's taken a long time to come to fruition, and a lot of effort from a lot of different parties, because it's quite challenging to get 3 partners to agree about commissioning. We're on that journey now. So from a cope and recovery perspective, and from a perpetrator perspective, we're looking at joining and joint commissioning with county and city from October 18.
Brilliant.
Which is good. So you've stolen one of my next slides, which was one of the early ones I was going to look at. The fourth service on there is community engagement, which we briefly touched upon, which was on the back of a review of domestic abuse services specifically. The need arose for more work within the community to raise the profile of the services that are available. We did that. We then commissioned IDAS to continue to do that work on an ongoing basis, and it is increasing the awareness of the services that are available, because all of our services, whether you come to the force or not, in terms of reporting a crime, are available to self-referring to.
And I should say, if there are any victims out there, that you don't have to come to the police if you don't feel comfortable. There are other ways, so IDAS being the major one.
IDAS's website, IDAS is 24 hours a day, 7-day-a-week helpline, and you can access any of the services available.
On the community engagement, Jenny, is that community engagement generally, or does it focus on hard-to-reach groups?
It's specific to raising awareness around domestic abuse. It's specific around going into communities that we've identified in terms of underreporting. So, for example, we've had some significant increases in military areas around self-referrals because of some of the champion work that IDAS have done. So we've got 45 new champions around domestic abuse in different settings, and they've been kind of, again, we've seen some significant impact from that in terms of...
Have we got the spread amongst those communities that we wanted? So it sounds like you have in Catterick, for example.
I think there's always more that we can do, but we're starting to make some inroads in that, aren't we? So, yeah, that's positive. Domestic abuse...
Sorry. Just so I'm clear, because I mean, one of the things that we set out on this journey was to make sure that people could access support.
Yes.
So the number of referrals is a really positive thing. So I'm just trying to get my head around. So we've seen a 10-fold increase in the number of referrals since 14-15. But we're only engaging 40% of those people now.
From an IDVA perspective.
Yeah. So my worry is we've gone out there, we've said, please come to us, please look for help, but we're not keeping the same level of engagement that we had previously. So it's just not clear what the impact of that is then.
Yeah, and some of that is because that's Q1 data, and I know that it's the same for 2016-17. Some of that is around the recording of information by the provider, which we're working with them to make sure that we understand better, because actually that's a reflection of IDVA cases, which are our high intensity cases. So you get a case manager and that service follows you throughout your journey. What we're not capturing there specifically is where an individual has had triage services, has had just a safety plan done. This is 40% engagement with an IDVA. So we need to make sure that we're reporting in the right way that gives you the assurance and PCC the assurance that this It's 40% IDVA cases. It's not the interaction that we've had with victims from the 1,846
So
or the 630 perspective.
To follow that through, it could be that only 40% of those people need an IDVA, but it might be
Yes.
more than that do, but we don't provide them with one for some reason.
Well, what it will be is that for the 1,846, for example, in 1617, the provider will have attempted contact. A proportion of those are not able to be contacted or refuse a service once they're contacted. 40% of them go on to have an IDVA service specifically, and then other proportions of them will receive things like triage services, which
Okay.
is practical advice and guidance, or perhaps a safety plan. So we could provide all of that data as well.
I suppose the issue for me is more around kind of what's hidden amongst that 60%.
Yes.
Because the people we need to help are often the people who don't want the help.
Yeah.
Which goes back to Nigel's point before. And the other bit for me is kind of, so what's the proportion, where are those referrals coming from?
All of these referrals are from MYP. So this is just about MYP referrals.
Not
Obviously,
third-party
there's-
reporting or anything like that?
There are self-referrals also, but this is just purely about what's coming through MYP. There's another aspect of that which we could report on as well. It's just not included within this presentation, that's all.
But do we know what the percentage is between where are all the vast majority of referrals coming from? Are they coming from the police or are they coming from social services? Are they coming from third parties?
NYP.
Yes, they're coming from
Right.
MYP.
So the point I'm trying to get to, so that tenfold increase in referrals
Yeah.
is because all the work we've put around training and engagement and
Absolutely.
confidence building amongst our
Yeah.
staff to deal with things, that might be a positive reflection on that.
Yes.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Which is great that we're still, well, you could maybe say, Jenny, that number of self-referrals are probably still lower than we'd like, but that's not to say it's not very good work that's increased referrals from the police.
And I think
But,
that,
but we shouldn't leave self-referrals sort of
yeah.
leave that to us.
And I think what Nigel said earlier around the Marac cases and the individuals that are referring to there, or the agencies that are referring to there, I think that demonstrates the fact that there are cases coming to the table from multiple agencies and they're being brought to the attention and then something is being done about them, whether that's about support for cope and recovery or whether it's an interaction from the force. People are coming together to talk about instances of domestic abuse that they know about from a referral perspective.
Going back to just knit together what you and Nigel talked about separately, so we've got victimless prosecutions where someone might not necessarily want to be involved, but for their safety, that case is taken forward. If they've opted out of services from supporting victims, is there any way to try and re-provide that, given that it's going forward anyway, and there may be court, there may be other things involved? Do we sort of keep trying through that because they might realise at some point, actually, I'm relieved this is happening?
Yes, yeah. And that's the only thing we can do, is just keep trying to engage them in relation to it. Sorry, yeah, just that's all we can keep trying to do, is engage them.
Okay. So we don't take no for an answer necessarily.
No, shouldn't do.
No, and from a provider perspective, we've been trying to work with IDAS to understand what they currently do and make sure going forward that we understand at what point they're re-engaging when somebody has chosen to disengage. Because depending on risk, as we identify it, we would like them to take a different approach. So if somebody has said, I don't want to service, but we consider them to be high risk, we might say, well, we want you to repeat contact that individual to try and get them into service at a kind of a more frequent level than if they were considered for us to be standard risk.
Yes.
But we want them to continue to try and get them to engage with support services.
And I suppose the other side of that coin is, I'm assuming if someone's self-referred in, they're more likely to accept a service, so you'll get a very high percentage of engagement from those.
From a referral to engagement study. In reality, there is no referral to engagement because they've self-referred, they've phoned the helpline, they've either had practical advice or they move on to having an IDVA if that's considered the right approach.
There's two elements really, isn't there? There's the prosecution stage, if that's where it's going to. But just because it isn't going for prosecution or because you disengage doesn't mean that you will get a lesser service. We still want to offer you a service in relation to it, you know, because if we believe that the right thing to do is to prosecute because that makes people safe or what they've done should be held accountable for, then obviously the victim in that gets a service in relation to that. But just because it doesn't progress to that, we are still trying to provide services to those individuals because they still need a service.
And does that apply to those who might be on the right to ask type scheme or civil orders? Does this include all those people?
and that's part of our challenge, which is part of one of the issues that we were kind of going to raise. So but it's 253s and
Yeah.
NYP filling those in that are the current referral point into our provider
Yes.
of the IDFA service.
If we get a right to ask or a right to know, we should be doing a risk assessment in relation to that relationship in that individual.
Is the implication by saying should that we don't always?
No, I would say we do. I would say we do. I would say that is standard.
Right.
If we're making a disclosure, we will be making a risk assessment because we wouldn't make the disclosure otherwise.
No.
We must deem it necessary for us to make the disclosure, and because of that, a risk assessment should follow in relation to it, and then it should start the process off in relation to it. Because at that time, it might be, although we make a disclosure, there might not be any actual offences committed between them, but they've just asked the question,
Yeah.
is my partner?
Yeah. I want to know. Yeah,
Yes.
Yeah.
So,
Sorry, Jenny, again.
That's okay. So the early intervention service is something that we commissioned on the back of a review of the community safety funding services. So it was identified that there was a good practice pilot going on in York, which had an evidence base around reducing re-victimisation. So this was about standard risk victims. So intervening earlier, safety planning, coping recovery work, to try and reduce the frequency or severity of domestic abuse incidents going forward. So we looked at utilising community safety funding to commission that service across the county.
And that
we
county-wide?
have done, yeah, so that's now a county-wide service since 2016-17. From an offender perspective, so we've got the Respect programme. Again, this was done on the back of the community safety funding review, and it was identified that early intervention services for both victims and offenders was necessary. So Respect, again, was a programme that was being piloted in York. Respect is an organisation as well as a programme. They developed the programme and it had run in multiple areas, York being one of which. Again, it saw some positive outcomes in relation to changes in abusive behaviour shown by young people. So it's a 10 to 17-year-old programme for individuals displaying abusive behaviour into family again.
And I know from the slide on this specifically,
Yes.
there's 12 on the waiting list.
Yes.
I've no context to know if that's a lot or a little, or how long they might be waiting,
Yes.
that kind of thing.
It's the challenge that we have is in running this programme, we have identified a need that is greater than the capacity we
So
have
we've
within the
uncovered.
service.
Okay.
There's also a number of needs within the cohort which we've identified which aren't deliverable through the current programme. So we've got some...
You've opened a can of worms.
We have, absolutely, but in a very good way, because this means we can actually look at need and demand more thoroughly and look at commissioning more services to meet those needs. So we've identified the need for potentially young perpetrator programmes. So at the moment we have a voluntary perpetrator programme, which is a little bit further down this list. But what we don't have is a specific perpetrator programme that would be appropriate for young people to go on. So we're looking at whether our partners could develop something for us. We're also identifying complex need cases, so where mental health is an issue. The Respect programme at the moment isn't necessarily appropriate for that, or if it is, it's taking a considerable amount of time to deliver, which means that's why we're creating a waiting list. So we're looking with respect to the organisation to do a review of the need and demand that we've identified through running this programme to see what other interventions we might need. And this has happened across multi-agency. So multi-agencies refer into this programme and we've identified a number of different level needs which we need to explore further and think about recommissioning.
Is that relatively normal for perpetrator programmes to have these multiple needs once you've sort of got someone in a programme for X? Actually, you uncover that there's a need for Y and Z.
I think what we had hoped is that within the 10 to 17 cohort, the Respect programme would deliver against the needs that we'd identified. However, the story is more complex within that group, and because we've identified that, we need them to understand what it is that their needs are and commission to meet those needs.
Yeah.
So it's positive, but obviously we have a waiting list which isn't positive, but we need to address that pretty swiftly, and we'll do that if we need to increase the Respect programme availability, we'll do that.
Yep.
Voluntary domestic abuse perpetrator programmes came about again under the community safety funding review that we did. Again, it's about early intervention, but this is for adult offenders. So we commissioned our community rehabilitation company to deliver those services for us. So this is where individual perpetrators are not mandated by the court to go on a programme, but we would suggest through our intelligence that actually it's necessary that the individual has an intervention, and if they volunteer to go on that intervention because they want to change their behaviour, then we would make that accessible to them.
This is going to be my last question because we need to move on.
I know.
But I hear this is an obvious question. If they're voluntary and 30% of people are engaged with that, I presume it's actually the 70% that might not be engaged that we want to speak to. If they're engaged, that's good, obviously, but they're already aware and understanding of what they're doing. It's the 70% who aren't engaged that we...
I think the reality is, yes, there's probably some of that 70% are going to be the ones that really we would want to target. However, having said that, the court process should address those with the highest need, and we can do more to work with the CRC and MPS to make sure recommendations to the court are more thorough and therefore can be considered, and therefore we get more intervention programmes put onto rehabilitation orders than, if that was the case. It's difficult to know that, considering we're not going into detail perhaps with those 70%, but we could look at that.
Jenny, can I suggest we carry
Of
this
course,
on at a later date? Because
Yeah.
there's a lot of work gone into this and we need to make sure we make the most of it, but to ensure Phil has his day in the spotlight as well, with his performance update, I suspect we might need to move on. But there's lots to go out there. It sounds like there's certainly an awful lot of services we're providing. It's trying to understand how, are they achieving that vision that you set out at the beginning?
Yeah, and I think probably the key message for me is from a victim's perspective and an offender perspective, what we're looking to do is joint commission going forward with County and City, which will streamline services, make them easily accessible for victims and offenders, and we've got one place where information is coming into. So that will help us in terms of tracking outcomes and tracking the offender and re-victimisation. So it's positive going forward.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Right, well that is the end of item 4. Item 5, I think Phil is over to you for our performance update.
Okay, if it's okay with you, Chair, I shall canter through
Please do.
the section. A lot of the data is very similar to the one presented last month, so to give you an opportunity to discuss the force control room. So in terms of overall crime, we're again around about 6% increase on last year. Again, still remains lower than the national average of a 10% rise, and we still remain the lowest crime rate per 1,000 head of population in England. With regards to killed and seriously injured, again, it continues with a long-term downward trend in relation to that, and it looks like we're going to have on target to hit a reduction in relation to the number of casualties against the previous 2 years. Force control and call handling continues to be an exception. I'll come on to that in more detail later on. In relation to satisfaction rates and public confidence, again, 8 out of 10 victims satisfied with the service. And we've now got data from the new survey in relation to victims of domestic violence, which shows a positive indication in relation to how they're being treated as well.
On satisfaction, this you might be able to answer, Jenny. Is that victims in the criminal justice sense, i.e. we only speak to people who are victims of crime, or is that people who are more involved generally in policing contact? Do we know?
From the perspective that does talk about, I'm not quite sure. From our perspective, it would be purely victims of crime. Apologies, it would be purely victims of crime from our perspective. However, having said that, all victims are asked. Therefore, we will have some self-referrals in there, so it will be a mix.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so going on to the next slide, just outlines in relation to the crime figures again, as previously presented last month, in line with previous long-term trends that we've been seeing in relation to that. Antisocial behaviour again is similar in line with last year. Public safety and welfare continues to be an upward trend in relation to incidents that have been attended in relation to that. Specific operations, again, just to highlight a few for you, in relation to last month's Public Accountability Board regarding thefts from quad bikes, burglary and others in rural areas. Lots of work done on in relation to that. and again, number of arrests made and significant amount of stolen property recovered over in West Yorkshire area with regards to those criminals travelling across into North Yorkshire rural areas to commit crime.
And do we feel that that's, yeah, I know this dealt with is a bit too emotive a term, but is that the issue that we felt in Harrogate and Craven, is that particular sort of spike now probably dealt with?
What I would suggest it's too soon to say whether or not. It's certainly disrupted.
Yeah.
It's certainly a significant find in relation to stolen property.
Okay.
I couldn't give you any comments
No.
to say that it's over at this moment in time. It's too early for that, I think. Again, Scarborough areas, we're looking at street dealing, drug dealing activity in relation to that, and again, particularly around the county lines type of offending, where we've got metropolitan areas coming into Scarborough area to deal with drugs, and there's Operation Variety running in relation to that. Around York, there's utilisation of our mosaic data to have a look at identifying where the most vulnerable are in relation to potential victims of fraud and other crimes, in particular the elderly, and there's prevention work taking place with our multi-agency partners around that. Rural Crime Task Force, again 7 arrests made in 2 nights following Operation Sidekick deployment, which is targeting the quad thieves in the Craven area. Quad bike thieves, not quad thieves, sorry. And again, significant wildlife prosecutions ongoing in respect of the raptor persecution and for fox hunting in that area as well. We're looking at opportunities to disrupt organised crime groups committing crime in rural areas as well, which has been scored at the recent organised crime group meeting. Problem solving wise, we've linked in with a project with a technology company that's involved in a pilot scheme in terms of preventive marking for sheep in rural areas to assist with the theft of livestock. I won't tell you the operation name of that, I think people can read that for themselves. So public service wise, again, the Rural Crime Task Force has been engaged in 9 local shows, events over the summer period. They've released a Q2 newsletter with further dates and further engagement to come out, and they've got over 5,000 views on their Twitter account and Facebook account.
And I've personally had some good feedback from people who've come across NYP at shows to say it was really sort of engaging and positive. Can I just ask on the productivity paragraph of that, the Rural Volunteer Patrol?
Yeah.
What is that?
So again, I think it's our Rural Crime Task Force linking again with members of local community in the rural areas to look at doing some joint patrolling, etc.
Is it a sort of form of watch scheme-ish?
Similar to
sort of a development thereof?
Yeah.
Okay. Can I ask for some information on that? Someone send something on that outside the meeting.
You can do,
just to understand.
I don't know how mature it is, though.
Well, that's fine. I don't mind.
Yeah. Okay, Operation Hawk, again, has been running in July. The Roads Crime Team arrested 12 offenders, recovered 4 stolen vehicles, seized 5 vehicles, seized a property value of £110,000. And again, the Northern Team, 9 arrests, recovered a stolen vehicle, 24 vehicles seized on that team, and £135,000 worth of property seized with regards to that. There are several other operations running in relation to. I won't go through those now, but I'll leave those for.
I see ANPR popping up there again. That sounds like that's proving its worth repeatedly.
Yeah, some positive activity ANPR wise. I know only yesterday we had, in relation to domestic violence, the topic today, we had a foreign force inquiry from Leicestershire with regards to a missing female and a wanted male for domestic violence. Missing female was her partner. They were recovered in our area. He was arrested. She was recovered back to her area and support given to her.
Right.
So, and that was a result of ANPR. Notable investigations, they remain as is. Again, there's no change in relation to those from the last presentation. Crime-wise, by district, just of note in relation to Selby, obviously the rise in crime was discussed at the last public accountability meeting. Most of that was attributed to theft from unattended motor vehicles. 6 arrests have been made in relation to that. A lot of those vehicles were, nearly all vehicles in a crowded car park being targeted by this local group from Selby. Operations run by the local policing team there, resulting in the 6 arrests, and the investigation is progressing in relation to those.
Is that in the old days where you might have recorded one crime for a sort of, when someone scrapes a key down 10 cars in a row?
Well,
and they're now all separate?
It was literally, it's an unusual MO because they were breaking into vehicles, smashing windows, etc., to steal from within the vehicle, and we're talking loose change. It's really low value items that they're doing it, but they would hit every single car in the car park. So it's a really unusual MO in terms of what we would traditionally have seen for theft from an unattended motor vehicle.
Okay.
So again, yeah, good proactive operation. Again, it was local offenders to Selby that committed that.
And the Harrogate sort of red.
Yeah, so again, we're looking at, we had a spate of burglaries. I mean, again, it'll be similar for Selby and Harrogate. So because we've had that volume and spike, although we've dealt with it, we're not going to see that red change because it's had a significant impact on the figures for those areas over the year. But again, we're looking at Operation Sift is running in the Harrogate area. That's related to some organised crime groups causing significant amounts of criminal damage, some burglaries, etc. in there, and there's a dedicated operation wrapped around that as well running in relation to that. That's also contributing part to some of their antisocial behaviour rise, as well as the Valley Gardens issues as well that we've been seeing there.
Okay.
So, ASB, I've just summarised there.
I'm glad to see confiscate. We've had a councillor or two mention mopeds in York North, so I have mentioned not confiscate to them, but I'm glad to see that's...
There is a focus on, and the York Commander is aware of that and the Safe Neighbourhood Inspection in relation to that.
I should say for members of the public listening, it's not the same moped gangs you see in the Met or anything. It's antisocial use of mopeds rather than sort of criminal theft and things.
Yeah. So moving on to Force Control Room.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, I think I've gone too far in relation to that. So the current Force Control and Performance Indicators have been outside normal range since and since July. The demand is increasing on 999 and 101. So just to give you an example in relation to what that looks like, on average, we've seen 6,114 999 calls in the month of July. Sorry, to date. What we're then seeing from July, that's a 20% increase on the previous year in relation to that. That's our target time for averaging answering 999s is 10 seconds. With that 20% increase, plus the increase in 101 calls, we've seen that target time rise to 20 seconds as an average time for answering 999 calls. So in comparison, our 101 calls for the period of July, again, we've seen 20,000 in relation to those. That's a 6% increase in 101 calls. And again, we've seen a rise in the average speed time up to 4.5 minutes in relation to answering some of those calls. So we are seeing some significant pressures in relation to the volumes of calls that are rising through the control room. Comparing that against previous years, so on average we would see an average of 185 999 calls a day is what we would be looking at. At the moment, for May, June, July and August, each month is rising. So May we saw an average of 213 calls per day. June we saw an average of 235, July was 264, and August, only up to 1st of August to the 20th of August, not the full month, we're seeing an average of 287 999 calls. It's a significant increase for us. So there's 100 extra 999 calls that we're looking at, volume of calls a day into the force control room that we're seeing at the moment this month. When you compare that to previous, so in relation to us not being able to answer a 999 call within 2 minutes, which is where there's a significant challenge for us in that, up until June 2017 we've never been in that position. But I think you can see in relation to the volume of rises in calls where those significant pressures are coming in place. I'll come on to talk about the plans in place that we're trying to do to tackle that. But
right in thinking, Phil, we've had requests from other forces to answer their 999.
Yes, so on average we're taking 87 calls a month, 999 calls for other forces in surrounding areas on top of our own demand that we're looking at there as well. And again, that's generally because those forces are not coping, or the 3-9 calls made on the border with North Yorkshire and the other force.
And
so
before
go to either one.
We come on to the various things you're doing to try and address that. I don't know if I'm asking you, Phil, or the Chief, but is there any understanding yet as to why there is this national increase sort of all of a sudden, effectively?
There's, well, as we've discussed previously, this is every single force in the country. So I don't think there is one reason. There's several reasons, I suppose. One is that The weather in the first part of the year was different to what it would normally be, far better than it would traditionally be. Secondly, the security situation has led to a significant increase in both the demands placed on the service to deal with particular jobs, therefore not available to be deployed to do other jobs, and we're just creating a vicious circle. And certainly West Midlands reported that they were having calls stacked up unable to respond to it. One of the forces that's asking other forces to do 999 calls is the Metropolitan Police. So this is across the nation. The other thing I think is that, certainly from the 101s, is that there's a danger that because you can't get through to 999, you're ringing 101, we're creating this vicious circle. And also the fact that, and it's in some of the detail here, that a lot of the calls that we're receiving after 5 o'clock would normally have been dealt with through other agencies who are not there between sort of the hours that we're actually available to the public. So there's a whole facet. The other thing I would say is that there's been issues around our own internal processes that we're having to address, and Phil will get onto some of that. But yeah, every chief in the country is trying to answer that question. There's some national work being done by Simon Edens, who's the chief in Northamptonshire, who's the performance lead for the National Police Chiefs Council, trying to get into why this is actually happening.
And I suppose in the meantime, we don't expect that demand to reduce because it sounds like it's literally going up month on month by X number of calls, give or take. We don't see any sign of that tailing off yet.
No, and I think one of the things is there's this, you know, the police service is going out asking people to ring us.
Yeah, and we do
So
all the time.
We've done it through 101, we're doing it through the 999s, through sort of the security situation. So, but it's also whether or not this is the start of a trend, or the trend has started some time ago and we didn't pick it up. And that's some of the detail we're trying to get through. But some of ours is internally an issue because of changes to technology, which have put calls internally through to our control room, which Phil will talk about.
Yeah, so in terms of the national data sets as well, there's no readily available national data sets, as the Chief has said, but looking at those, so the force data sets that we've got, we are not an outlier in terms of abandonment rates over the last 3 months, and we're not an outlier in terms of average time to answer speeds either. Although we want to improve that and we want to get a lot better at that, I think it's, you know, we're not standing out from other forces in the country who are experiencing the same sorts of issues.
Just the other thing, and I think we need to challenge, I know it was raised previously that somebody had alluded to the fact that they'd spent 6 hours on the phone. The longest call we've had is something around 38 minutes. Which is not acceptable. But I think, you know, we just need to be clear around the facts that we're talking about. I think one of the things that we're trying to do is to ensure that we actually are responding to the calls that are emergency calls, which is 999. That has to be the focus. Yeah. The reason why we have 101 is it's a non-emergency number. So I know it's a bit unpalatable at the moment, but we have to focus on the 999s in the first instance.
And I know you'll come on to Phil, all those things that are going on to address that. But one of the things I don't think is in there is at the moment, largely, apart from a couple of road safety things, I think 101's basically the only place you can report non-emergency things. It's also about the other ways we can give people to start getting in touch with the police that isn't a telephone call.
That's right, yeah, and that's part of the customer service work that's ongoing as well through Kate Williams.
Tom?
So,
Can I just ask, sorry, yeah, in terms of understanding what the calls are that are coming in, do we have updated information yet on the breakdown of calls in terms of PSW and mental health and all the different things?
yeah, we understand. So each call is tagged with a type.
Has there been a particular increase in any one sort of those classifications?
I can't say whether there's been any particular increase in any one side. I don't have that data in front of me. I do have some inclination of some of the challenges we're facing around the types of calls we're getting in that are inappropriate. Some of those are internally for us to deal with as well. So, and again, it's back to what the Chief is saying around individuals ringing 999s for inappropriate reasons, or you know, as opposed to waiting on for 101. So I'll come through what some of the measures are that we're trying to do to address that, because and then talk that through in terms of what the plan is.
Yep. It helps. I mean, at 5 o'clock every morning, we get an update about the daily performance, if you like, on a trend basis. So obviously, we've seen an increase of about 6% in crime, so therefore there's an increase of 6% of people ringing in to report crime. But antisocial behaviour is down by about 3.5%. These are operational figures, so therefore they've not been audited. But PSW, which is the public safety and welfare, this year compared to last year has seen a 3% increase. So one of the things we have found is
Which is a lot of calls, 3%, but actually that's a lot of calls.
I suppose one of the issues is around, we get an awful lot of calls into the control room that don't actually then lead to a deployment. So we're getting contacted by lots of things, which actually then doesn't lead to police having to actually deploy a resource, or actually they're not able to pass it on to another agency. So trying to understand that and then finding a better way of gatekeeping and sort of helping people to kind of not ask us when the local chemist is open 24 hours a day.
Take your bins out.
So some of the things that we're doing in relation to trying to address the challenges that we're facing. So obviously this has been managed under a gold strategy by the Deputy Chief Constable. Some of those measures are activation of a hold for operator option, and the operator function has been live for 3 weeks. 300 calls a day routed through that. Over 50% are for other people or other departments in the force. Abandoned calls at automated switchboards have reduced by 56%, and the voice recognition has improved from 82 to 88.5% recognition with regards to bringing in that operator function.
Do we know how many of those are internal? Yes, so I know the Chief said we have an internal demand that we're creating here, and I don't know if part of this is helping to mitigate that, partly by stopping people calling, but also dealing with those calls that we know are internal better and not go to the control.
There is part of the plan is an internal communication strategy to reduce some of that demand that we're placing on our own force control room. I don't have the figures, I'm afraid, but it is included within the mitigating measures that were put in place.
So just to help, if you look at the figures in relation to the operators that we've put in place, there's a broad split of calls. 60% were for other departments and people and forces, and 40% were for the force control room. Now previously, all of those would have gone to the force control room. So, and one of the issues that we found internally, because of the change in our unified comms, is that part of the process is if you then can't get hold of somebody, it defaults to the control room. So we're having to look at some technological solutions because we're creating some internal demand as well, which is unhelpful.
Yeah, and because I know there was some discussion about where the operator call comes in. It's effectively a sort of option 5 without saying so. You wait for all the options and then you hold for the operator. And I think we just need to be mindful, make sure that is the right place for it. It probably is, but make sure that we're not giving people an option too late that they might take earlier and avoid going to the control room at all. So how many of those calls, the Chief said, that end up with nothing being done might be dealt with by an operator and not holding for 4 minutes and not taking up time for a call handler in the control room. But I don't think that's a straightforward decision.
Okay, and again, one of the measures in place is diverting calls for the Traffic Bureau, again, because it's specifically people ringing in relation to tickets being issued, etc., things like that they can deal with directly. The internal communications have been highlighted already, and external communications going out to the public as well in relation to the use of 101 in correct circumstances and outlining what those would be for the public. In terms of managing the call demand and workload within the force control room, some areas that we're looking at have had some impact. So we've had some IT systems failures recently that they're not wholly responsible in relationship, but they've magnified some of the existing issues and challenges that we're facing in the control room recently. And again, we're working with colleagues to try and put those right. We're projected to have a queue buster installed on the 30th of August, which will give the caller the option for a callback so they don't have to wait. So again, that should stop those repeated calls into 101, so we can have the confidence that actually they can hang up the phone and wait for us to dial them back. An automated system will pick the appropriate time and let them know roughly how long that will be for them to receive their call back. And again, as a result of the work undertaken by our Nexus unit, the recommendations in relation to the crime recording functions and occurrence management functions within the control room will be removed from the force control room call handlers on the 5th of September, and that will mean that staff won't be doing that work alongside taking calls, will be focused on taking the calls.
So the inevitable question is, Phil, when do we feel like if there is a time you can put on it where we might start seeing average calls waiting times reduce again? Because I know this staffing's the other one. We've got staff coming in.
Yeah, I'll come on to that in a second. Yeah.
Given all that, do we hope to see a difference? So before demand started going up, I used to say to people October time, because we were doing all these things anyway. Now these are sort of keeping us treading water while demand's going up. Do we think these things will make a significant enough difference to start seeing calls
Yeah, I think you're looking towards end of September, October in terms of the conversation I've had with the Force Controller Manager, where we're probably starting to see some of that positive impact coming through. In terms of boosting the staff within the Force Control Room, there are more staff going through training. In October, we'll have 16 new starters, 12 communications officers taking calls and 4 dispatch officers. And in January, there'll be a further course of 20, where there'll be 12 dispatch officers on that course and 8 communications call takers on that course. So the training programme again has been revised because due to the volume of people coming into the control room and the requirement for them to be tutored, prior to these intakes we'll have been doing that on a one-to-one tutorship basis. What that means then, their experienced call handlers are tied up doing the tutoring, it slows it down being able to take the calls and handle them through. So we're going to do that in a different way due to the volume of people we're recruiting, and do that through a tutor unit that will sit separately from the force control and train them up in the room next door. So the impact of these, like I say, August the operator line went live, and the first 8 days it took over 2,000 calls. Agency staff have been recruited until the longer term recruitment that I've just outlined there is embedded. Initial assessment types of calls been handled by the operators, as the Chief's outlined there, 60% for other departments, other people in the forces, and 40% that actually were calls that the force control room should have been dealing with. There's been a surge in demand of those classed as quick queries dealt by the operator, from 17% in a day to around 42% in evenings and weekends. This is where we're looking at, actually, this is around other agencies.
Yeah.
So might not be calls that are a requirement for the police, could be local authority, could be other agencies out there. But because those agencies aren't open at that time, people are resorting to ringing the police in relation to that. Some key statistics for us: abandonment rate, automated switchboard levels reduced by 56%. So from 64 calls per day in January to 36 calls a day in August. So that's a positive in relation to that for us. And that indicates to us that callers are happier to wait for the operator rather than hanging up and then trying to ring back again. And again, recognition rate accuracy has increased from 82% to 88.5. So that's when we ask for somebody by name or caller number or department, that the software is picking up on that recognition, the voice recognition, a lot better now. National context I've presented already. So in terms of force control room, that's the main overview for the performance conference.
Thank you, Phil. And I appreciate there's a lot of work going on. I think, again, everyone is acknowledging that it's not good enough at the moment, and there is a lot of work going on to improve the service. So, public who are trying to get through, bear with us. We're doing what we can. We've got a few more slides at the end. I'm never quite sure who presents these anymore, with HR things and mental health.
I've got those, but they're no different to the previous ones.
Okay.
So we're on track in terms of recruitment, etc. and things there. So unless there's any real outlines, this.
Well, given we are running behind now significantly, we'll skip that over. I did have one question, but we answered that in the actions, which was about street triage in York, so I'm happy with that. Okay, thank you, Phil. Item 6 is the forward planner, which we're up until January next year. And we discussed those outside the meeting, but we will add to those for February, March, April as soon as we can, so the public can get involved. Item 7 is questions. Emma, have we had any questions? No questions, so that saves us another couple of minutes. And then we're on to any other business, so I'll go around the room. No? No? No, thank you. Thank you very much. Sorry, everyone, for the 9-minute delay. Appreciate everyone's time, and see you this time next month for burglary. Cheers.